Please join in a moment of centering silence so we can be fully present with each other this morning. And now let's get musically present by turning to the words for our in-gathering hymn, which you'll find inside your order of service. And good morning, everybody. Of social. I'm Steve Goldberg, a very good-looking member of this. So welcomes summer's guests a special place. Guided after every service. You know the drill. This is by the service. So thank you for taking care of that critical task right now. This morning, by we. Minister, Janine Nussbaum, whose smiling face greeted us upstairs as we entered this morning. Liza Monroe, Dick Goldberg, Melinda Carr, and Eva Wright as our ushers. And thank you to Sandy Plish, who is handling the coffee preparations in the kitchen. A special hug and handshake to her. And then thank you to Ann Smiley for donating the flowers that you see behind me, and John Powell for serving as our tour guide. Now, speaking of volunteers, we need more volunteers. More people, because now we've got the 3 services have returned as a result of the fall season. I see a lot more long sleeves in the room than usual. And with fall comes the need for a bigger team of volunteers. We especially need people to operate the sound system, greeters, ushers, and persons to open the service with an articulate, friendly welcome and announcements. Dorgan, Jean, Universalist Service issued a joint statement. Donations remain great. They've announced a fund. Actually raised the information on the UU response to this crisis by going to uusc.org. Again, that website is uusc.org. With that, the announcements are over, except to mention that it's only 196 days to the next cabaret, and we invite you to sit back or lean forward to enjoy this morning's service. I know that you'll find it will stir your heart, touch your spirit, and trigger 1 or 2 new thoughts. We're glad you're here.
We gather in reverence before the wonder of life, the wonder of this very moment, the wonder of being together so close yet so apart, each hidden in his or her own chamber, each listening, each trying to speak, yet none fully understanding and none fully understood. We gather in reverence before all intangible things that eyes see not, nor ears can detect, that hands can never, that space cannot hold, and that program. No other creature, all creatures I would invite in. Don't we? Shorewood Hill died in the trees, and it's a story about a woman on a thigh. And in high school, that a college here in the studied biology. She studied about living things, and she did really, really well in college as well. And so she was able to go to graduate school. She went from Kansas to Pennsylvania, where she went to University of Pittsburgh, and a master's degree in biology there. But at that Africa, that were being, they all died. Scientists. She didn't really want to be what we call an environmental activist to try to change things. She knew that someone had to do something about this. So she began a vast movement called the Green Belt Movement. And the Green Belt, many trees to women, million. Of the nation. All the while in Kenya. And because of her work, Kenya now has more trees than ever before, women with all kinds of new skills, and what we call a more robust democracy. People all around the world heard Maathai, and because of her courageous efforts, she was awarded the highest honor that anyone. And so, classes with children's education. Have fun. Annie even our own. Breeding for a year, these fuel their surge to sexual maturity so that they might pump out billions more eggs. There is a terrible, innocent, benumbed world for animals, reducing life there to a universal chomp. What kind of world is this, anyway? Are we dealing here or with death? Use him. Consider the former. The world is a monster. Any 3-year-old can see how unsatisfactory and clumsy in an amoral world. But then I must consider the alternative, that creation itself is blameless, benevolently askew, very free, making all of this fuss. It's amiss. We are freaks, the world is out, and get our natural state. We can leave the favorite passages from Lauren Isley's The Unexpected Universe. Isley, too, was a well-known naturalist in the 20th century. The beaches of Costabel littered with the tree of life. Shell, a hermit where the worn fragments of green sponge yield as soon as the ebb was flowing. As I could make out, I rose and I dressed in the dark. Coming down the steps to the shore, I could hear the deeper rumble of surf. And of imperfection somewhere near the foot of that rainbow, I discerned a human figure standing, as it seemed to me, within the rainbow, and he was gazing fixedly at something down in the sand. Eventually he stooped, and he flung the object beyond the breaking surf. I labored toward him over a half mile of uncertain footing, and by the time I reached him, the rainbow had receded ahead of us, but something of its color still ran hastily in changing light forms across that man's features. He was starting to kneel down again. And in a pool of sand and silt, a starfish had thrust its arms up stiffly and was holding its body away from the stifling mud. I looked down. It's still alive, I ventured. Yes, he replied. And with a quick and gentle movement, he picked up that star and he spun it out over my head and far out into the sea. It sank in a burst of spume, and the waters covered it once more. It may live, he said, if the offshore pull is strong enough. He spoke gently, and across his bronzed, worn face, the light still came and went in subtly shifting colors. There are not many who come this far, I said, groping in a sudden embarrassment for words. Do you collect? Only like this, he said softly, gesturing amidst the wreckage of the shore, and only for the living. He stooped again, oblivious to my curiosity, and skipped another star neatly across the water. The stars, he said, they throw well. One can help them. And then he looked full at me with a faint question kindling in his eyes, which seemed to take on the depths of the sea. I do not collect, I said uncomfortably, neither the living nor the dead. I gave it all up years ago. Death is the only successful collector. And I nodded and walked away, leaving him there upon the dune with that great rainbow ranging across the sky behind him. But then I turned as I neared a bend in the coast, And I saw him toss yet another star, skimming it skillfully far out into the ravening and tumultuous water. And just for a moment, in that changing light, that sower appeared magnified, as though casting larger stars out upon some greater sea. He had, at any rate, the posture of a god. Love that organ. Thank you, Dan. On September 4th, 1965, Dr. Albert Schweitzer died at the hospital he oversaw and in which he had practiced medicine for better than a half-century. Schweitzer was 90 years old, and the old man chose to die here in Lambaréné, Equatorial Africa, rather than back in his native Europe, because, as he put it to his fellow workers, I feel at home here, and I belong to you until my dying breath. And by the time of his death, Schweitzer had become one of the 20th century's most widely admired figures, one of civilization's last true Renaissance men. He was a theologian, a meticulous biblical scholar whose book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, remains a classic. He was a consummate musician who began serving as a church organist at the age of 11, and he later became chief organist of the Paris Bach Society. And as an organist, he was enchanted by the music of J.S. Bach, even as many of us are, whom he once described as a poet and painter in sound. Schweitzer also earned a reputation as a builder of fine pipe organs. This was painstaking. At one point, he wished that he never troubled himself about it. But the reason he did not give up the struggle, he said, is because the organ was for him part of the struggle for truth. Although his medical practice in Africa was consuming, Schweitzer still found time to write several major works of philosophy, and in his later years to join with eminent figures like Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and world peace. And of course, he cared for tens of thousands of African patients in one of the remotest medical facilities on the continent. He was a participant at all times in and a forerunner of every major social and humanitarian movement of the century, his biographer George Marshall writes. And as his reputation spread, Schweitzer was feted with honorary degrees, citations, commemorative stamps, and in 1954, the Nobel Peace Prize. But despite the honors heaped upon him, Schweitzer remained humble, self-effacing. He did not preen, he did not utter cosmic statements at the drop of a cause, a correspondent for Reuters News Service noted after his death. And the writer went on. He seemed, to many observers, he said, to be a simple, almost rustic man, dressed in rumpled clothing, who suffered fools gladly, stated fundamental verities patiently, and worked unobtrusively. And yet, he was by no means a man with a weak ego. Some of his more ardent admirers insisted that Schweitzer was a jungle saint, but he rejected such adulation, holding that his spiritual life was its own reward, and that his work is what redeemed him. Well, to Schweitzer's aesthetic, intellectual, and humanitarian Schweitzer's own telling us an axiom, bound for a distant village to treat a travel. But it was on trips like these that Schweitzer took frequently that he found he had long been searching, he said, for a universal conception of ethical. For 3 days on that raft, he had been cutting sheets and sheets of paper, disconnected thoughts and fragments of ideas. He was getting frustrated. But then on the third day, as the helmsman was guiding that raft through a herd of hippopotamuses, the iron door finally yielded. And there flashed upon Schweitzer's consciousness that perfect ethical formula, reverence for life. Now, he said, I had found my way to the idea in which world and life affirmation and ethics are contained side by side. But while this succinct ethical formula seemed to arrive unbidden in a sudden insight, it had already found ample expression in Schweitzer's life. Now, he was a liberal Protestant minister's son, and when he was young, he was taught bedtime prayers by his mother. But the youngster, very early on, was troubled by the fact that he focused exclusively on human beings and on human beings' interests. And so after his mother had tucked him in, young Albert would typically add a short personal prayer of his own. Bless and protect all things that have breath. Guard them from evil, and let them sleep in peace. As a young man, Schweitzer excelled in several academic disciplines, including biblical criticism. But from his research into the Gospels, he became convinced that any true disciple of Jesus should heed his call for personal sacrifice. And Schweitzer thus resolved that he would devote the first 30 years of his life to scholarship, music, and art, but then he would spend the remainder of his life in direct service to humanity. He made this resolution at the age of 28. Many a time already, he wrote, I had tried to settle the meaning that lay hidden for me in that saying of Jesus, that whoever would save his life shall lose it, and whoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's shall surely save it. Now, he said, the answer was found. And to the outward, I now had a profound inward happiness. Missionary doctor, on the other hand, life. Of the all that the ethical is the essence of religion is firmly established on the authority of Jesus, he said. And for him, the Sermon on the Mount is the incontestable charter of liberal Christianity. On another occasion, he added, the ethic of reverence for life is the ethic of Jesus brought to philosophic expression, extended into cosmical form, and conceived as intellectually necessary. So what then did Schweitzer actually mean by that phrase, reverence for life? And with respect to our own regard for and our conduct toward others, what does that concept require of any of us? Now, when one hears this phrase initially, one may well visualize a figure like Lauren Isley's Star Thrower, a somewhat eccentric figure bent on rescuing creatures whom nature has consigned to oblivion. It could be starfish washed ashore with the tide. It could be earthworms writhing on a hot sidewalk after a heavy rain. Or it could be Mother Teresa pulling lepers off the streets of Calcutta in a noble effort to relieve at least some suffering. And Schweitzer himself strove to be as considerate toward human beings as he possibly could, and with other sentient creatures that were threatened with harm. As he oversaw the construction of new facilities in his jungle hospital, the doctor would make it a point to go out early in the morning and inspect every excavated trench and post hole in order to retrieve any small creature that might have stumbled into it during the night. Only then, when he had made his rounds, was work permitted to continue. Our former music director and frequent guest artist, Carlos Moser, says that he once met Schweitzer while he was studying music and conducting in Europe. And Carlos shared with me by email an incident that reportedly occurred when Adlai Stevenson visited the hospital in Lamborghini. The doctor and the statesman were in deep discussion when a mosquito happened to land on Schweitzer's arm. Stevenson casually swatted it, whereupon Schweitzer reprimanded him, saying, "That was my mosquito." But life, as Annie Dillard wrote, life is cheap, and evolution seems to love death more than it loves you or me. And Dillard questions whether her own regard for sentient life isn't irrational, a sentimental quirk. Among nature's myriad creatures, she observes, humans seem unique in their concern for the fate of other life forms. Now, I suspect Schweitzer, who was trained as a scientist, was cognizant of all of this. But for him, this concept, reverence for life, invested human life with meaning. And in his maturity, Schweitzer eschewed supernaturalism. He did not present reverence of life as some God-given mandate. He was not conventionally religious. And while the principle was, for him, an outgrowth of the teachings of Jesus, Schweitzer thought that that concept was of a piece with the finer elements that are native to human beings, reflecting our rationalism, our altruism, and our compassion. He often characterized reverence for life as a mysticism of reality, because it could be experientially verified, but was, like all mysticisms, in some sense, inexplicable. To those who questioned the principle's rationality, Schweitzer responded, "Hey, in what sense is violence rational? Look at World War I and II. Millions of combatants, tens of millions of civilians, uncounted millions of animals were killed, were slaughtered in those two contests. Was that rational? Why? Why did that happen? Because we did not possess the highest rationality, which is reverence for life." Schweitzer went on, "Because we do not yet possess this, every people is afraid of every other. Each causes fear to the other. We are mentally afflicted one for another because we are lacking in rationality. There is no other solution than reverence for life, and at this we must arrive." The principle accords with reason in the second place, because it leads to happiness, because it fulfills our nature. It is through an ever-widening investment in the lives of others and an acknowledgement that their will to live is every bit as important as my will to live. It's with this recognition that we move, Schweitzer said, from thinghood to egohood, and finally to freedom and integrity of personhood. Schweitzer believed, and he felt this to be true for himself, that the saving and promotion of life delivers the deepest happiness that can ever fall to a person's lot. He did not deny that this ethic demanded a considerable measure of personal sacrifice. Schweitzer himself had left a life of material comfort, academic acclaim, pursuits which he truly loved, in order to become a mission doctor in a very difficult environment. "Go thou and do likewise," he urged. The ethic of reverence for life constrains all, in whatever walk of life they may find themselves, to give themselves to those in need, to give them help and sympathy. It does not allow the scholar, he said, to live for his science alone, even if that science is very useful to the community in doing so. It does not permit the artist to exist solely for his art, even if he gives inspiration by its means. It refuses to let the businessman imagine that he fulfills the legitimate demands in the course of his business activities. No, it demands from all of us that we should sacrifice a portion of our life for others. Now, Schweitzer here was offering a general principle and not a detailed prescription. He did not provide us with a yardstick by which we measure our sacrifice against somebody else's. Everyone, he said, should decide on the basis of their own thoughts, the circumstances that attend their life, how best to proceed. If you apply your reason to the problem, he believed, you will know how to act. But not reason exclusively. We also need reverence, which is the mystical part of the equation. And to revere something is to see something as awesome, to see it as holy. And according to the philosopher Paul Woodruff, it is the virtue that keeps us humble, that keeps us free from hubris. An exclusive reliance on rationality will cause us to overestimate our capabilities and to become arrogant. Reverence, Woodruff says, is most obvious when it is missing. And it is missing in those people who are, or who think they are, exceptional. Reason and reverence. In Schweitzer's ethic, the one presupposes and complements the other. Now, of course, this phrase, reverence for life, may have been new, but the principle itself was hardly without precedent. The Jains and a significant segment of Buddhists have embraced the doctrine of ahimsa, or non-harm, for over 2,500 years. And Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, Schweitzer's contemporary, he allowed snakes and scorpions and spiders to wander freely in his ashram because he, too, was convinced that every creature has a right to blossom and to fulfill itself. Schweitzer's critics argued that his ethic was both impractical and unrealistic because it failed honestly to acknowledge the harm that we cannot avoid inflicting on other living beings. But Schweitzer, who witnessed death on a daily basis in Africa, he was hardly naive on this score, and he readily conceded that life preys on other life every day. and yet he staunchly defended this ethos of care. Reverence for life obliges us only to continually work on ourselves as we strive to become increasingly conscious of and compassionate toward other members of the biotic community. Albert Schweitzer was an exceptional and a gifted man with many admirable traits. But it goes without saying, like any human being, he was not without his flaws. In pursuing his medical practice, he neglected his role as a husband and a father. He presided over Lamborghini as an autocrat, a taskmaster with high standards and a low tolerance for criticism. And he was also a product of his time, paternalistic, convinced of the merits of the European colonialist system. Schweitzer was more respectful of Africa's indigenous cultures than most white Europeans of that time, and he even argued that the native population was entitled to reparations for the losses that they had suffered at European hands. And yet, he always regarded black Africans as children who were in need of white supervision. Schweitzer inveighed against the liberation movements in Africa in the 1950s and 1960s, which caused W.E.B. Du Bois to call him the last of the white fathers. Du Bois evinced grudging respect for Schweitzer, commending his efforts, as he put it, to alleviate the pain and the degradation of this part of God's earth. But then he also complained that in doing so, Schweitzer perpetuated colonialism by making life more comfortable under it. Schweitzer, he said, would have done better to focus on saving the souls of white men rather than the bodies of black men. Be that as it may, Albert Schweitzer was saving lives during a period when the European powers, the Belgians in the Congo, the Germans in Southwest Africa, the Italians in Ethiopia, the French in Algeria, where all of these colonialist powers were killing and maiming Africans by the tens of millions. Whatever his failings, Schweitzer did rise above a sentiment that privileged European lives over those of Africans, and the latter, those who privileged European lives, regarded those Africans as an exploitable commodity. As a, have we made years since Schweitzer? Has the principle of reverence for life gained greater traction? Reports of so much murder and mayhem, we might not think so. But then, psychologist Steven Pinker's recent analysis of the global evidence, there is far less carnage to be. The suggest that this may be the most time in our species' entire existence. And Pinker says that many factors have contributed to the decline in intra-species violence. But you know, for any small part that Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life may have played, we owe him a debt of gratitude. Blessed be, and amen. Our offertory today, as you read, will be shared with the Pie in the Sky Foundation that does wonderful work in Uganda, and there's a table out in the Commons afterwards where you can learn more about their activities. Please be generous. our Cares of the Congregation book always sits. We do invite you, if you have a joy or a sorrow that you would like us to share from the pulpit, to enter it before you come into the auditorium. No one put any entries in today, so we will, at this point in time, go right to our closing hymn. Please be seated for the benediction and the postlude. And we close with the words of Albert Schweitzer. The deeper we look into nature, the more we recognize that it is full of life, and the more profoundly we know that all life is a secret and that we are united with all life that is in nature. Man can no longer live his life for himself alone. We realize that all life is valuable, that we are united to all of that life. And from this knowledge comes our spiritual relationship to the universe. Blessed be and amen.